We have a customer with an MR18DE powered car who wants us to make some decent power. We'll be turbocharging it. After talking for several weeks about the possible risks we may encounter, it was decided that we needed to open up an engine to see what was going on in there, and how we can improve it to make sure it lasts. So all of the components you're about to see are out of an extremely low mileage engine that we managed to find locally. As we mainly deal with MR16DDT engines here, immediately we started comparing the MR18 to the MR16. The MR series engines all use a similar construction process, so before we took anything apart, we noticed some features in the outside of the block that were fairly close to the MR16. Mainly, we noticed the oil feed line port on the MR16 had a spot on the MR18. It was filled and casted over, but it was still there, which means it could be bored out and used for that purpose very easily. We then noticed that where the MR16 has the oil return for the turbo, the MR18 just has a smooth cast spot there. Because of where it is, you can very easily drill and tap that and use it as a return. So adding a turbo to this was already fairly straightforward. With the engine completely torn down, we started to measure and compare more main components. We were pleasantly surprised to find the MR18 uses significantly thicker connecting rods than the MR16 does, around 3.67 millimeters bigger to be exact. The casting and design looked identical to the MR16 rods, which told us, in theory, these rods would be stronger than the MR16 ones, which we regularly push to 300 horsepower. This is a good start. As mentioned in the previous video, the MR18 uses a larger bore than the MR16, which is where the extra displacement comes from. So we were hoping the rods would be interchangeable. Sadly, they are not. The center to center measurement is the same, but the wrist pin on the MR18 is significantly smaller than the MR16, 1.97 millimeters. This is the only weaker part of the MR18's rotating assembly that we could find. A smaller wrist pin means it's more likely to fail, but on a stock cast engine we would not ever push enough power to get to that point. This brings us to the piston. We knew the MR18 would have a larger piston. What we did not expect is to find that the piston would, like the rod, be the same design and construction as the MR16's. Obviously, because the MR18 is port injected, the dome shape is different, but the skirt shape, coating, and structure was the same between the two. This is again good news, as the piston should handle the power we are going to make fairly easily. The only major weakness we could find on the MR18 was the lack of a crank girdle. The MR16 has a large aluminum piece that ties all of the crank bearing caps together, making the engine much more rigid and less likely to have twist or stress related failures. Luckily, we found that the MR16 girdle and bearing caps bolt right to the MR18. This also means the MR16 oil pan bolts on. A major benefit to this is that the engine will now have a proper oil cooler, something the MR18 does not come with. An MR16 oil pump and oil pump chain/tensioner would need to be used, as the pump moves a bit further from the crank, and the bolt pattern is not the same. Note that the engine maintains the same height overall. With the pan and girdle on, we checked timing cover fitment. Sadly, this does not line up, as you can see. This is an easy fix for us though. Simply weld on a piece of aluminum, plane it on our mill, and install. So that issue is solved. In our previous video about the MR18, we mentioned the cylinder walls being thin. They are not. We measured the same thickness as the MR16. This surprised us. Sadly, the head gasket is only a 2-layer, and with no aftermarket options, we're going to see what our machine shop can come up with for using the MR16 gasket, as we know those will hold good power, and all of the holes line up properly between the two engines. Speaking of the head gasket, our ARP head stud kit fits the MR18. So another crossover part. We also test fitted the MR16 valve cover, which fits, except for one bolt, which is easy enough to make work. The PCV system on the MR16 is much more free-flowing than the MR18, so this would be a great upgrade when adding boost. The turbo manifold and intake manifolds do not fit at all, but we already have adapters in the works. The stock MR18 intake manifold has the plenum right where you would put the turbocharger, so in higher power applications, it would be best to change it. So, long story short, the MR18 is a capable engine, and with how it comes stock, it would make a good starting point for a build. Would we swap one into a Juke? No, no way. At the end of the day, it still is a naturally aspirated engine you are turbocharging. The cam and head are not set up for boost, it's got very high compression, and it only has intake cam phasing. But, with what we now know, a few badass MR18 powered cars will be running around soon.